deck. Hordes of people huddled over their possessions, which consisted of old pillows with feathers and the few pieces of silverware tucked in there and stuff like that, the candlesticks, and sleeping on the deck with one another, next to one another, to keep oneself warm. It took weeks and weeks and weeks. It took ages.
When I crossed the ocean, I never saw such waves in my life. I never knew an ocean existed. Approaching the New York Harbor, the Statue of Liberty was there, and it gave me a free feeling of liberty, a feeling of a new nation, a feeling of a new hope for a beautiful life.
There's something wonderful about being an immigrant. There's something so deliciously naive and happy about being an immigrant who has escaped from something. My father would say from time to time, no matter how bad things were, at least we're free.
In Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, it was said prosperity was measured by the thickness of the soot in the air.
Oh man, whatever them furnaces let loose, the whole sky was full of red dust. Full of red dust. If you had your wash out, you had your laundry out, it was too bad. You had to run outside and pull that laundry in because it would be covered in red dust. You would see them coal mines lit up from Greensburg all the way to Uniontown. It was wonderful to see it.
Relentless production in Pittsburgh's steel mills, foundries, and coal mines attracted an enormous number of immigrants, and poor whites and blacks from the rural South. It was their labor which fed the furnace of industrial America.
You had to pick everything up. You had to move everything by hand. No lunch breaks of any kind. You worked and you had a sandwich in your hand. If you had to go to the restroom, boom, back right away. They timed you. When you get home at night, you couldn't lift your arms up. I remember this. Oh, I remember this distinctly. My father would come home and say to my mother, rub my arms a little bit, because they were picking up. There was no, it was all mule work.
I had two uncles that worked in the mill. It was dangerous. No safety precautions were in the mills. You could walk in the mill and see people with one arm, one leg. You had an accident in the mills almost every 2 days, but nobody did anything about it.
There was no compensation for the injuries and death on the job, and it was almost impossible for workers in the early part of the century to organize.
They tried to start a union, and of course they had the coal and iron police, they were called in those days. And they would bust a lot of heads, and a lot of murders were committed, and a lot of things that you daresn't say too much. If you worked in a mill, if your boss said something to you, that was it. That was the law.
Industrial work involved 6 days a week, 12 to 16 hours a day. The daily wage, barely $2. Children, too, were made to work, 2 million of them across America, some as young as 4.
They did not complain as adults tended to do. Employers liked to think of them as happy elves.
E.L. Doctorow wrote about child labor in his novel of life in the early century, Ragtime.
They were more agile than adults, but they tended in the latter hours of the day to lose a degree of efficiency. In the canneries and mills, these were the hours they were most likely to lose their fingers or have their hands mangled or their legs crushed. In the mines, they worked as sorters of coal and sometimes were smothered in the coal chutes.
As a child, in the early part of the century, Pauline Newman worked 13-hour days in a New York garment sweatshop, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory.
We had a corner on the floor that resembled a kindergarten. You were not allowed to sing. We weren't allowed to talk to each other. The door was locked to keep us in.
The locked doors would prove to be fatal. On March the 25th, 1911, fire broke out at the factory with an exit door locked on the 9th floor. Many workers jumped to their death.
I was 11, and I remember all of a sudden all of East New York went crazy because the kids were running around with the newspapers hollering extra that all these people had died in that fire.
146 workers died. There were no sprinklers inside the factory then. There had never been a fire drill. The tragedy outraged a public that had become increasingly aware of both the underside of a prosperous nation and the need for reform.
The great reform movement of this period is called progressivism. It's a belief in progress. It's a belief that we can make things better, that you can have a more just, more democratic society.
At the vanguard of social reform in this particular period were progressive women concerned about their own inferior status.
When I was a girl, a woman didn't have rights to custody of their children. They didn't have the right to own property. A woman teacher didn't have the right to marry. She didn't have a right to live alone. She had to board with a family. And if she started dating or she went out at night, she was fired.
For progressives such as Frances Garrison Villard, suffrage, the vote for women, was the key to emancipation.
Grandmother was a very strong militant suffragette. As a boy, I was more inclined to laugh at them and dismiss them. I didn't see any reason why they should have a vote. I would say I believe that it's still a man's world, and it would continue so for some time to come.
Some suffragettes were mounting a violent campaign. In Britain, one of them was willing to die for the cause. In June of 1913, Emily Davison threw herself in front of the King's horse at the popular Epsom Derby. She died with the inscription, "Votes for Women," sewn into her coat. That kind of sacrifice inspired American suffragettes to intensify their campaign. The right to vote would also prove elusive for America's 9 million blacks. Black men could vote in theory, but in fact most were barred by white intimidation, poll taxes, and literacy tests. 85% of black Americans lived in poverty in the southern United States, segregated from whites by so-called Jim Crow laws, laws upheld by the Supreme Court that all but wiped out the freedom and equality once promised by emancipation.
It is the complete denial of the American dream. They cannot go to the same schools with whites. They can't drink from the same drinking fountains. They cannot sit in the same part of a streetcar or in the same cars on a railroad. It's a horrible time. White politicians compete with each other in the South for being more, at least verbally, violent toward African Americans, and in many cases are encouraging or at least abetting actual violence.
They were lynching blacks for hardly a week. There's 2 or 3 blacks didn't get lynched or burned at the stake. I don't know whether you heard that or not. You ever hear of any black people being burned at the stake? Well, that's what happened. I lived in those days.
The The most prominent black leader at the turn of the century, Booker T. Washington, accepted the notion of separateness. He asked blacks to better themselves through work and vocational training. From whites, he asked for help, not equality.
Booker T. Washington was born a slave, called his autobiography Up From Slavery. This is a man who has pulled himself up by his own bootstraps. And he takes the perspective that it would be foolish to challenge what's being done to them too soon and too openly.
But there would be a challenge. In 1905, the black intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois urged a new struggle for full political and social equality. Entrenched resistance to such change would make civil rights, as Du Bois predicted, the major social issue in American life for the rest of the century. At the turn of the century, there were 76 million people in America. The majority of them lived on farms or in small towns, where they relied on gaslight and horsepower.
Every morning the milkman came, and the cream at the top would rise, and if you got there early, you could take a lick of the cream before your mother found out what you were doing.
It was the great period of the front porch. In the evenings after dinner, the family would assemble on the front streets. Sometimes the neighbors would pass and we exchanged bows. We played games, I Spy and Run Sheep Run, and Lemonade, What Was Your Trade?
Tennis rackets were hefty and the racket faces elliptical. Women were stouter then. They visited the fleet carrying white parasols. Everyone wore white in summer. That was the style. That was the way people lived.
But the rhythm of American life was quickening in the early years of the century as more and more people headed for the cities, for the bright lights and the myriad opportunities.
I was 4 years old when I came to Chicago. It was a real magical thing to see the streetcars moving up and down and the street filled with people all the time and great activities going on. And I recall looking at it with wonder.
The cities, New York City more than most, were centers for the latest engineering and technological marvels.
The skyscraper is born in that time, a completely new building form, a completely new idea that a city could grow up instead of out.
It's an amazing sight to me. I saw the Flatiron Building. I saw the Woolworth Tower. It's a very stunning view, how a building can pierce the sky.
And underground, there was a new way to travel. In New York City, the subway was inaugurated in 1904. One could ride the subway to the outskirts of the city, where the power of science and technology was harnessed for pursuit of a good time. Tens of thousands of New Yorkers went every day and night to Coney Island.
When I came there, my brothers immediately treated me to a hot dog, Nathan's. I dove right into the water. I tasted all over me the salt of the sea. I was baptized by nature. There was a kind of freedom that I never dreamt that I could have.
That sense of freedom was also spread by the availability of ideas. In the early part of the century, some 9,000 public libraries in the country dispensed information freely and democratically.
One